The winter of 2023 was particularly harsh in Detroit, with temperatures plummeting to record lows and snowfall that seemed endless. For Ethan Parker, a 19-year-old working the night shift at Manny's Diner, these bitter nights meant fewer customers and smaller tips. The young man had been juggling this job with community college classes for nearly a year, desperately trying to help his mother, Sarah, make ends meet after his father's sudden passing left them drowning in medical debt. Their small two-bedroom apartment in the east side of the city was barely kept warm by an ancient heater that rattled through the night, but it was home. Ethan's shoulders carried the weight of responsibility far beyond his years. His mother's arthritis had worsened, limiting her cleaning jobs, and his younger sister's college applications loomed on the horizon. That particular Tuesday night, as frost patterns formed intricate designs on the diner's windows, Ethan couldn't have possibly imagined how taking out the trash would forever alter the course of his life. The metal dumpster behind Manny's creaked as Ethan pushed against its frozen lid, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The sound of rustling plastic made him pause. At first, he thought it might be one of the stray cats that frequented the alley, but when he peered around the corner, the sight before him stopped him cold. An elderly man, his weathered face partially hidden beneath layers of mismatched clothing, was methodically sorting through discarded food containers. What struck Ethan most wasn't the man's homelessness, unfortunately a common sight in their neighborhood, but rather the meticulous, almost confused way he examined each item, as if trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. The old man's hands trembled violently, whether from cold or age, Ethan couldn't tell, and despite the multiple layers, his thin frame shivered uncontrollably. When the elderly man finally noticed Ethan's presence, he didn't run or apologize as most would. Instead, he looked up with cloudy blue eyes that held a peculiar mixture of dignity and utter bewilderment, as if he himself couldn't quite understand how he had ended up behind a diner at midnight in the dead of winter. "Sir, are you all right?" Ethan asked, taking a cautious step forward, noticing how the man's gaze seemed to drift in and out of focus. The old man straightened up with surprising grace, brushing crumbs from his tattered coat with hands that bore the distinctive age spots and prominent veins of someone well into their 70s. "I believe I was looking for something," he replied, his voice cultured and clear despite his appearance, though he trailed off as if the thought had simply evaporated mid-sentence. Ethan felt something twist in his chest, recognition, perhaps of the same lost expression his grandfather had worn in the early stages of Alzheimer's. "Are you hungry? I can get you something warm to eat," Ethan offered, already shrugging off his own coat to place around the man's shoulders, despite the biting cold that immediately cut through his thin uniform shirt. The old man accepted the gesture with a nod that somehow managed to be both regal and childlike in its gratitude. "Henry," he suddenly announced with unexpected clarity. "My name is Henry. At least, I'm fairly certain it is," as Ethan gently guided him toward the diner's back entrance. He couldn't have known that this simple act of kindness would set in motion events that would transform not just one life, but many, including his own. Inside Manny's, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow that accentuated every line on Henry's face, revealing a map of experiences that seemed both present and somehow unreachable in his eyes. Manny himself, a burly Greek man with perpetually flour-dusted hands and a reputation for gruffness that masked a surprisingly soft heart, raised an eyebrow at Ethan, but said nothing as the young man settled Henry at the counter. The night cook, Darius, who had worked alongside Ethan for months, understood without words, sliding a bowl of steaming soup and a grilled cheese sandwich across the counter before Ethan could even place the order. Henry's hands shook as he lifted the spoon, spilling nearly as much as he managed to consume, but he ate with the deliberate focus of someone performing a half-remembered ritual. Between careful bites, fragments of stories would emerge, mentions of a garden he once tended, a dog named Chester, mathematical equations that seemed to make sense only to him before his train of thought would derail, leaving him staring into his soup with a furrowed brow. Ethan found himself mesmerized by this mysterious man who seemed to drift between lucidity and confusion, like someone caught between two worlds. As the clock ticked past a.m. and Ethan's shift ended, a dilemma presented itself. The local shelter was undoubtedly full on such a bitter night, and the thought of sending Henry back into the cold made Ethan's stomach clench uncomfortably. The decision formed in his mind before he fully processed it, a decision his mother would call pure Parker stubbornness, but what his late father had always termed doing what needs doing. The bus ride home was silent, Henry gazing out the window with the wonder of someone seeing the city for the first time, occasionally pointing at landmarks and starting sentences he couldn't finish. The walk from the bus stop to their apartment building was treacherous with ice, and Ethan found himself supporting much of the older man's weight, noting with concern how little there was of it. His mother would be asleep by now, her early morning cleaning job requiring her to rise before dawn, but Ethan knew she would understand. Sarah Parker had raised her son to believe that kindness wasn't optional, it was necessary, especially when it was difficult. As they approached the worn brick building that housed their apartment, Ethan found himself whispering reassurances, though whether they were meant for Henry or himself, he couldn't quite say. Sarah Parker's reaction upon finding a stranger asleep on their couch the next morning was not what most might expect. There was no shouting, no demands for explanation, just a quiet assessment as she stood in her cleaning uniform, thermos of coffee in hand. At 45, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered storms without breaking, her dark skin marked with lines of both laughter and worry, her close-cropped hair showing more gray than black these days. "You're just like your father," she finally said to Ethan, who had risen early to explain before she discovered Henry on her own. There was both pride and resignation in her voice, the tone of a woman who had spent decades loving a man who could never pass someone in need without stopping. She approached the sleeping figure gently, noting the clean clothes Ethan had found for him, his father's old things, still kept in boxes they hadn't had the heart to donate. When Henry woke, confusion clouding his eyes before recognition of Ethan brought focus, Sarah simply handed him a cup of tea and asked if he preferred his eggs scrambled or fried. Later, as she prepared to leave for work, she pulled Ethan aside, her voice low but firm. "He can stay until we figure something out. But we need to find out if someone's looking for him, Ethan. Someone probably misses him terribly." The weight of her words hung between them, the unspoken understanding that people like them, people with so little to spare, were somehow finding room for one more at their table. The morning shift at Manny's diner brought its usual chaos, the clatter of plates, the hiss of the grill, the constant chime of the door as construction workers and office employees alike sought their morning caffeine and carbohydrates. Ethan hadn't planned to bring Henry along, but the elderly man had become agitated at the thought of being left behind, his eyes widening with a fear so primal it made Ethan's decision for him. Manny's reaction to the unexpected visitor was characteristically blunt. He touches nothing, breaks nothing, scares no customers. But within an hour, Henry had found his place, meticulously folding napkins into perfect triangles with the concentration of a surgeon, occasionally pausing to stare at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. The regular customers, the kind who had been coming so long they were practically fixtures, approached Henry with curious kindness, something about his dignified confusion bringing out a protective instinct in even the most hurried business people. By lunchtime, Henry had graduated to organizing silverware, his methodical precision suggesting a lifetime of order and structure that remained even as his memories seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. Ethan found himself watching Henry between orders, wondering about the life this man had led before he ended up searching through dumpsters in the dead of winter. The poster caught Ethan's eye during his mid-afternoon break, a flash of color on the community bulletin board where people advertised yard sales and lost pets. Missing, Henry Whitfield proclaimed bold letters above a photograph that made Ethan's heart skip the same distinguished face, though healthier and more focused, the same cloudy blue eyes, though sharper with awareness. The poster described a 72-year-old former mathematics professor with early-stage dementia who had wandered away from his son's home 3 months prior during a moment of confusion. The address listed was in Bloomfield Hills, one of Detroit's wealthiest suburbs, worlds away from the struggling neighborhood where Manny's Diner served bottomless coffee to people counting their change. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he carefully unpinned the notice, his mind racing with implications. When he showed the poster to Henry, something extraordinary happened, a flicker of recognition, like a light switch being flipped in a darkened room. "William," Henry whispered, tracing the contact information with a trembling finger. "My son, William." The name seemed to unlock something in him, and words began to flow more freely, though still disjointed fragments about a university career, a late wife named Eleanor, a garden with roses that bloomed even in October. Ethan listened, transfixed, as pieces of a life emerged from the fog of Henry's mind, revealing glimpses of the man he had been before his memories began to slip away. The decision to take Henry to the address on the poster wasn't an easy one. Ethan felt an unexpected reluctance, a strange protective instinct toward this man who had entered his life less than 24 hours ago. The bus ride to Bloomfield Hills took nearly 2 hours with transfers, during which Henry alternated between periods of remarkable clarity, explaining complex mathematical theories with the confidence of the professor he once was, and moments of profound confusion, where he would turn to Ethan with panic in his eyes, needing reassurance that he wasn't alone. The neighborhood, when they finally arrived, was exactly as Ethan had imagined: sprawling homes set back from the street, manicured lawns despite the winter season, luxury cars in circular driveways. Henry grew increasingly agitated as they approached the address, clutching Ethan's arm with surprising strength, murmuring something about not being ready and disappointing William again. The house itself was imposing, a modern structure of glass and stone that seemed to rise organically from the landscaped grounds. Ethan hesitated at the gate, suddenly aware of his worn uniform, his scuffed shoes, the social gulf that yawned between his world and this one. But Henry's grip on his arm reminded him why they had come, and with a deep breath, he pressed the intercom button. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, wary, the voice of someone who had learned to be cautious with unexpected visitors. "My name is Ethan Parker," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I believe I've found Henry Whitfield." The next moments unfolded with a dreamlike quality, the electronic gate sliding open with a soft hum, the hurried footsteps on the stone pathway, and then the appearance of William Whitfield himself. At perhaps 50, William had his father's height and bearing, though his features were sharper, his movements more precise. He stopped abruptly at the sight of them, his composed expression crumbling into naked shock, and then something far more vulnerable. "Dad?" The single word contained volumes: relief, disbelief, joy, and a profound weariness that spoke of sleepless nights and endless searching. Henry stood straighter at the sound of his son's voice, something shifting in his posture, as if pieces of himself were clicking back into place. "William," he said, with more certainty than Ethan had yet heard from him, "I believe I've been away." The understatement hung in the air for a moment before William closed the distance between them, embracing his father with careful intensity, as if afraid he might somehow break or disappear again. Over Henry's shoulder, William's eyes met Ethan's, a gaze filled with questions and a gratitude so raw it was almost uncomfortable to witness. Ethan stood awkwardly at the edge of this reunion, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a private moment, acutely aware of the bus schedule and the evening shift that awaited him back in a world that seemed increasingly distant from this one. Inside the Whitfield home, the contrast with Ethan's own living situation couldn't have been more stark. Soaring ceilings, artwork that probably cost more than his mother's annual salary, furniture that had clearly been selected by someone with both taste and the means to indulge it. Yet there were also signs of disruption: a makeshift office in the living room with maps pinned to walls, lists of hospitals and shelters, a whiteboard tracking possible sightings. William had been searching methodically, desperately for his father, employing private investigators and maintaining a constant vigil of hope, even as weeks stretched into months. As Henry was gently settled into what was clearly his favorite chair, he went to it automatically. Another piece of memory asserting itself, William pulled Ethan aside, his voice low and intense. "Where did you find him? How is he? Has he been?" He couldn't finish the question, the possibilities too painful to articulate. Ethan explained as best he could the dumpster behind Manny's, the night at his apartment, the poster that had connected the fragments of Henry's identity. With each detail, William's expression shifted between horror at what his father had endured and profound relief that it hadn't been worse. The doctor said his memory might come and go, William explained, watching his father, who was now examining a framed photograph with focused attention. He wandered off during a moment of confusion. "I just stepped away to take a call, and when I came back," his voice broke slightly. 3 months. He's been out there for 3 months while I searched everywhere, but apparently not the right places. The story emerged in pieces as a housekeeper prepared tea. None of them would drink. Henry had been a brilliant mathematician, a professor emeritus at the university, widowed 5 years earlier when Eleanor succumbed to cancer. His decline had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first: misplaced keys, forgotten appointments, the occasional disorientation. William had moved his father into his home after finding him one day attempting to drive to his old house, which had been sold years before. The arrangement had worked well until the day 3 months ago when Henry, in a moment of clarity within confusion that characterized his condition, had decided he needed to go home, not to his son's house, but to the home he had shared with Eleanor for 40 years. Without ID, without proper winter clothing, with only the vague direction of home guiding him, Henry had wandered farther and farther from safety. The police said. William paused, composing himself. They said after the first 48 hours, we should prepare ourselves. That people with his condition, in winter conditions, he didn't need to finish. Ethan understood the statistics, the likelihood of survival, the miracle it was that Henry was now sitting across from them, gradually reconnecting with his surroundings. As the reality of the situation fully registered, Ethan became acutely aware of the time his shift would start soon. His mother would be wondering where they were. The last bus that would get him to work on time would leave in 20 minutes. When he stood to explain his need to depart, William seemed almost startled, as if he'd forgotten there was a world beyond this moment of reunion. "Of course, you need to go. But please, let me arrange a car for you." Before Ethan could protest, William was already on his phone, and Henry was looking up at him with a clarity that had been absent before. "You helped me find my way home," the older man said simply, reaching for Ethan's hand with both of his own. "I won't forget again." The ride back to Manny's diner in the sleek town car William had insisted on arranging gave Ethan time to process the whirlwind of events. The driver, professional and discreet, asked no questions about the young man in a diner uniform being chauffeured from one of Bloomfield Hill's most prestigious addresses. Ethan stared out the window as neighborhoods transformed from manicured estates to industrial zones, to the familiar, worn buildings of his own community. He had left his phone number with William, scribbled on the back of a Manny's receipt, the only paper he had, feeling oddly certain he would never hear from the Whitfields again. After all, what more could there be to say? Henry was home, safe with his son, surrounded by comfort and care that Ethan could never have provided beyond that one night of shelter. As the car pulled up to the diner, Ethan thanked the driver and stepped out into reality, the evening rush already beginning. Manny visible through the window, gesturing animatedly at the kitchen staff, the familiar rhythm of a life that suddenly felt slightly off-kilter, as if the encounter with the Whitfields had shifted something fundamental in his perception. He arrived at his station just as Darius was hanging up his apron, receiving a curious look and a barrage of questions about the old man that Ethan answered with a simplicity that belied the complexity of his emotions. "He's home now," was all he could really say, the words feeling both completely true and somehow insufficient. 5 days passed in the usual blur of work shifts, community college classes, and helping his mother with her increasingly painful arthritis. Ethan had shared this story with Sarah, of course, who had listened with the quiet attention she always gave matters of consequence, nodding at the description of the Whitfield home without judgment or envy. "You did exactly what your father would have done," she had said, her highest form of praise. The experience had begun to take on the quality of a strange dream, vivid, but increasingly distant, when the bell above Manny's door chimed during a quiet afternoon lull. Ethan looked up from the counter he was wiping to see Henry and William Whitfield standing in the entrance, looking simultaneously out of place and perfectly at ease. Henry was transformed, clean-shaven, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket that somehow suited him perfectly, his posture straighter and his eyes clearer than Ethan had yet seen them. William guided his father with a gentle hand at his elbow, but there was less anxiety in the gesture now, more habit than necessity. Manny emerged from the kitchen, eyebrows raised in silent question, as Ethan moved toward the unexpected visitors. "We wanted to thank you properly," William began, but Henry interrupted with newfound assertiveness. "I remember everything now," he said, his voice stronger than before. "Not just William or Eleanor or my work. I remember you, Ethan. I remember the dumpster and the cold and how you gave me your coat, even though you were shivering. I remember your mother's tea and how she asked if I preferred my eggs scrambled or fried." His blue eyes, no longer cloudy but sharp with purpose, held Ethan's gaze. "I remember that you saved my life when you had very little to give." What followed was a conversation that would alter the trajectory of the Parker family forever, conducted at a corner booth over Manny's surprisingly good coffee. William, it emerged, was not just wealthy, but influential, the CEO of a technology company he had built from the ground up, with connections throughout the city's business community. He had spent the past days learning everything he could about Ethan and Sarah Parker, their struggles, since Robert Parker's death 3 years earlier, the medical bills that had drained their savings, Sarah's lack of health insurance that meant her arthritis went largely untreated, Ethan's determination to complete his education despite working full-time. "My father says you took him in without hesitation," William said, his voice carefully controlled, but his eyes betraying deeper emotion. "That your mother welcomed a stranger into her home when you barely had room for yourselves." Ethan shifted uncomfortably under this assessment, unused to having his family's private circumstances discussed so openly. "Anyone would have done the same," he insisted, though all 3 men at the table knew this wasn't true. Henry's hand, steadier now than days before, reached across to cover Ethan's. "Not anyone," the older man corrected gently. "Not everyone sees humanity in a confused old man digging through trash. Not everyone risks bringing a stranger into their home. Not everyone, Ethan." The proposal William then laid out was presented not as charity, but as opportunity, a position for Sarah in his company's administrative department, with full benefits that would cover her medical needs. A scholarship fund for both Ethan and his sister. Connections that could translate Ethan's community college credits into a full university degree. "You gave without calculation when my father needed help," William concluded, his businessman's composure momentarily cracking to reveal raw gratitude. "Allow us to do the same." Later that evening, as Ethan rode the bus home, William had offered a car service again, but Ethan had politely declined, needing the familiar rhythm of public transportation. To ground himself, he watched the city lights blur through the window, trying to process the day's events. The folder William had given him sat heavy in his backpack, containing paperwork for his mother's new position, details of the scholarship arrangements, and contact information for the university admissions counselor who was expecting his call. It felt surreal, like a plot from one of those inspirational movies his mother occasionally watched on Sunday afternoons, the kind where fortuitous coincidences led to life-changing opportunities. Except this wasn't a coincidence or a movie. It was the result of a simple choice made in a frozen alley behind a diner. As the bus lurched to his stop, Ethan found himself remembering his father's voice, a memory so clear it was almost like having him there. "The measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching, son. It's what they do when no one is." Robert Parker had lived by those words, often to the detriment of his own comfort, taking extra shifts at the factory to help neighbors with medical bills, spending weekends repairing elderly residents' homes instead of resting. Ethan had sometimes resented his father's generosity as a child, not understanding why their family always seemed to have just enough rather than plenty. Now, stepping off the bus into the cold evening air, he felt a profound connection to the man who had shaped his instincts, whose moral compass had guided him even in his absence. Sarah was waiting when he arrived home, her eyes bright with a hope he hadn't seen since before his father's illness. She had already received a call from William's assistant, confirming details of her new position, and the reality of their changed circumstances was beginning to sink in. "I can get proper treatment for my hands," she said, looking down at the fingers that had grown increasingly gnarled and painful. "And Jasmine can apply to any college she wants." His sister, a high school senior with a brilliant mind for engineering but limited prospects due to their financial situation, was already poring over university brochures online, her future suddenly expanding beyond community college and part-time work. As they sat at their small kitchen table, the same one where Henry had eaten scrambled eggs just days before, Ethan felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, gratitude, but also a quiet pride that had nothing to do with receiving help and everything to do with the knowledge that his instincts had been right. "Your father would be so proud," Sarah said softly, reaching across to squeeze his hand, her eyes glistening. "Not because of what's happening now, but because of what you did that night. Because you're his son in all the ways that matter most." Outside their window, snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes drifting past the streetlights, but inside their apartment, for the first time in years, the future felt as warm and bright as summer. 3 months later, on a crisp spring morning, Ethan stood in the garden behind the Whitfield home, watching as Henry carefully tended to early rose bushes with the focus and precision that characterized his good days. The older man's condition remained. The doctors had explained dementia didn't simply disappear, but with proper medication, routine, and support, his lucid periods had lengthened and stabilized. Ethan's visits had become a regular occurrence, initially at William's insistence, but continuing because of the genuine connection that had formed between the young man and the retired professor. Henry had taken to tutoring Ethan in mathematics, his academic mind still brilliant despite its occasional wanderings, preparing him for the university classes he would begin in the fall. "You know," Henry said, carefully pruning a wayward branch, "I've been thinking about probability lately." Ethan smiled, used to the professor's sudden shifts into academic territory. The mathematical chances of our paths crossing that night were infinitesimally small. The variables involved my wandering to that specific location, your shift ending at that precise time, your decision to investigate the noise. He trailed off, momentarily lost in calculation before finding his thread again. By any statistical measure, we should never have met. And yet, here we are. He gestured between them, encompassing not just their physical presence, but the unlikely bond that had formed. Some might call it divine intervention. As a mathematician, I prefer to think of it as a beautiful anomaly in the pattern of the universe. Ethan considered this as they continued working side by side in the garden. This unlikely friendship that had blossomed from a moment of basic human kindness. Perhaps it was an anomaly, a statistical improbability, or perhaps it was simply what happened when people chose compassion over indifference, connection over isolation. Either way, as the spring sun warmed his face, and Henry launched into an explanation of chaos theory that somehow related to rose cultivation, Ethan felt profoundly grateful for whatever forces, mathematical or divine, had brought them together on that frozen winter night.